graphically bounded. Texts were vital for disseminating ideas and creating a sense of cohesion. Feminist publishing companies, printing collectives, grassroots distribution, and feminist bookstores began proliferating in the late 1960s. And in 1976, we saw the first Women in Print conference with an emphasis on coalition building and an ideological foundation based on second wave feminist values. About 130 women gathered, mostly white, mostly lesbian, from 80 different organizations. During that time, the 20 bookstores in attendance used their time to establish a coalition, and they created a vision statement that from the outset described a conception of feminist bookstores that went beyond retail sales, emphasizing their existence as a nationwide network of women's spaces and information centers. They articulated a desire to emphasize cooperation, attend to feminist politics, practice accountability to each other and their communities, and support feminist media. They made concrete action plans, including establishing a communications network with a feminist bookstore newsletter, and they always acknowledged their hybrid nature. In the words of one, to find ways of dealing with the inherent contradiction of being revolutionaries and being in a capitalist business system. When we look at the population of North American feminist bookstores, a database that I constructed with archival material brings together nearly 400 individual feminist bookstores between 1970 and 2017, but there was a tremendous amount of turnover. The highest number opened simultaneously was 125 in 1994, and as of 2017, there were 13. The feminist bookstores relied on each other for information and support rather than relying on other bookselling networks and organizations. Like other independent bookstores, they were facing competition and struggles with the burgeoning movement of chain bookstores opening up in shopping malls where they were able to offer free parking and discounted prices. And they couldn't afford the fees associated with membership in the American Bookselling Association. So they created a hybrid field that straddled feminism and commerce and turned to each other for support. The creation of this hybrid field created tensions within the community as well. Those who were opposed to the idea of creating businesses grounded in feminism said, for instance, that it diluted the essence of radical feminism and settled for a reformist ideology that the mainstream could approve and that effaced women's real racial, sexual, and class differences. Others criticized capitalist exchange systems, wanting things to be run on a sliding scale basis rather than with fixed prices. But many wanted to create alternatives to show examples of how a business could be run in a different way. Carol C.J., a co-owner of a bookshop called Old Wives' Tales in California, initiated the Feminist Bookstore News that was created as a goal during the Women in Print conference. And this became referred to as the Bible for feminist bookstores. It was in print from 1976 to 2000. The earliest issues, you can see how labor intensive they were and grassroots. They were typed and mimeographed, full of typographical errors, last-minute handwritten messages in the margins, editorial comments that included personal messages along with bookstore news. And the initial format of a stapled sheaf of papers gradually grew into a publication with consistent design elements and standardized content. Typical contents included lists of forthcoming books, relevant events, announcements about openings, closures, and moves, articles about bookstore management, but the most compelling to me were the letters. In an era before email, listservs, and social media, the letters shared women's struggles, raised questions, and announced triumphs. It often resembled a disembodied support group as they asked for advice or wondered how they managed to stay afloat. One bookstore owner wrote, "It's so fantastic to hear our own experience being echoed by other women, so affirming, and it makes us feel less isolated." I decided that I wanted to analyze these letters in particular. And to date, I have looked at all of the ones that were published in the first 40 issues of Feminist Bookstore News. So that's 417 letters ranging from 1976 to 1984. And I used qualitative content analysis. For some context, during this time period, the number of feminist bookstores ranged from 85 to 114, but again, with a great deal of turnover. So only 31 listed in 1977 were still there in 1984. I went through first to establish 4 different categories of letter topics: news items, organizational operation, publisher distributor relations, and products. So all of the letters fell into one or more of these categories, and the percentages don't add up to 100% precisely because most letters dealt with more than one kind of issue. Then in order to look at what really interested me was that as hybrid organizations operating both from a feminist logic, but having also to fit into a market logic, I wondered whether all aspects of feminist bookselling used this kind of hybrid logic, or whether there were some aspects that emphasized one over the other, and how they managed to make compromises that allowed them to fit into this market system. So I turned to a typology of feminist logic and market logic that was put forward by Taylor and Rupp in 1993. So contrasting egalitarianism with hierarchy, collectivism with individualism, an ethic of care versus an ethic of individual rights, respect for knowledge derived from experience versus respect for abstract knowledge, and finally, cooperation versus competition. And I coded each letter for their similarity to feminist or market logics following these characteristics. What I found was, I'll go through each of the categories and explain how the different logics played out. So the news items tended to emphasize feminist news. They also provided general news that would have been of interest to any bookseller, special services offered by the US Post Office, an upcoming merger of Time and the Book of the Month Club, and the state of Georgia banning the American Bookselling Association from exhibiting any book which can provoke or arouse lust or passion at the 1981 convention. But feminist and lesbian issues got more space and emphasis. The first International Feminist Book Fair in London in 1984, Random House announcing in 1977 that the market for women's books is over, the revelation that the publisher of a feminist book series was a subsidiary of Playboy Enterprises, and updates about British customs officials confiscating publications with gay and lesbian content. And then, of course, there was the news specific to individual feminist bookstores, shops that were opening or closing, special events that they found worked really well, or shops weathering natural disasters, harassment, and vandalism. And in these cases, it's interesting that they were not just reports of these incidents, but active calls for help or reports about aid that had been received from other feminist bookstores. When we look at organizational operation, there's a more clear blend of feminist and market logics. As I said, the ABA provided lots of resources for booksellers, but the cost was prohibitive. And most women were coming into feminist bookselling with a really strong sense of mission and passion, but without particular experience, training, or skills in bookselling. So they had to turn to each other for support as they figured out how to do this. Much of their conversations dealt with balancing feminist values with traditional business practices. Cooperation and collectivity dominated within the field and with individual bookstores, while the market logic played out more when they were interacting with external organizations and having to match particular policies, practices, and language being used. One bookstore owner said it's not always easy to run a business collectively, but so far we feel the struggle is very much worth it. It sometimes feels like a total contradiction to run a business collectively, but the concepts of collectivity are among the most important that the women's movement deals with. So as they juggled to balance feminist and market logics, for example, one bookstore owner wrote about how she reluctantly decided to divide labor by skill and enjoyment level rather than maintaining a strict rotation where each collective member took turns doing every single job in the bookstore. Feminist Bookstore News relied on all feminist bookstores to submit material to the publication, making it a true collective enterprise. And they also encouraged financial contributions from stores doing well that would help subsidize subscriptions for stores that were struggling. Interestingly, while both mail order and sale of used books were employed by lots of different kinds of bookstores, feminist book women explicitly grounded these choices in an ethic of care. stating their desirability to make sure that women had access to this information, regardless of where they were geographically and regardless of what their finances were like. And they did this without consideration of whether the decision would result in more profit for the store itself. But when dealing with mainstream entities outside of the field, there was often a need to use more of a market logic or find creative ways to adapt. There were still bills to be paid, accounts to balance, and business relationships to maintain in a world that does not operate under feminist egalitarian kinds of manners. One store faced difficulty getting a bank account because they had to list an owner. They were a collective and did not have an owner and did not want to have an owner. So they ended up just randomly choosing one person to be listed in order to be able to follow the policy and get the account. Publisher and distributor relation discussions also showed a blend of feminist and market logics. Letters in this category tended to either be doing about the logistics of doing business with publishers and distributors or protests against problematic policies and products. Together, the bookstores showed a collective willingness to challenge mainstream companies and other feminist organizational communities when they ran into difficulty. When mainstream business practices threatened feminist bookstores financially, the letters raised concerns about market-oriented issues like profit or efficiency. But interestingly, the responses and solutions were met with a feminist logic. For instance, when a store had too many copies of a book and a publisher would not accept a return, they would ask if other stores would take them at cost. They also sometimes would have credits left over with a publisher that they didn't intend to order from again, and so they would arrange trades. This kind of matchmaking also occurred with resources, such as reference sources like the American Bookselling Association handbook or books in print that were very expensive. So matchmaking would occur between stores that couldn't afford them and stores that were about to get a new edition and could pass on the former edition. Similarly, Publishers Weekly was too expensive for most of them, so someone who did subscribe would volunteer to cull lists of relevant titles from them and print them in the newsletter. While they initially didn't want mainstream publishing to be involved in feminist bookstore news, when one came asking about being able to purchase advertising space, they thought about it deeply and then decided to take this on and begin offering advertising with the logic that they could take advantage of the additional income coming from a thriving publishing entity. They also exhibited collective efforts to protest popular feminist titles going out of print. A feminist logic might have led them to have open dialogue with the publishers about the cultural importance of these texts, but they chose instead, in this case, to emphasize a market approach, which they knew would appeal to the publishers. They would continue to write in orders for books, even when they were listed as out of print, to demonstrate demand. And they also engaged in protests about women's portrayal in books or on book covers. Finally, for the merchandise and products, they used an almost exclusively feminist logic here, with feminist bookstore news often being a gatekeeper and arbitrator. So as I mentioned, book lists culled from Publishers Weekly, specialty lists of books for lesbians, multicultural books, foreign language books, not without controversy over the inclusion of specific titles or about the contradictions of being generally against censorship while still banning some materials from their shops. One bookstore owner wrote, "How do we draw the line between censorship and responsibility, judgment, whatever you want to call it? I could blame everything on lack of money or lack of space, but I know damn well there are some books I wouldn't buy if I had all the money and all the space in the world. Feminist, even more than gay, is a word with plenty of gray area." They would keep books in stock longer than mainstream stores, even lamenting sometimes that when they buy what they believe in, it's not always what sells. So we see that the news items and discussion of news in the world was heavily feminist with some market influences. Both organizational operation and publisher-distributor relations mixed a feminist and market logic, but with the products, they retained an almost exclusively feminist logic. Now, it'll be interesting to see when I'm able to analyze further issues up to 2000, whether these categories stay the same, whether there are shifts, either in the logics or in the kinds of issues that are brought forward. But none of this deals with the customers and the customer experience. And that's where my most recent article came in, looking at Distribution Matters, Feminist Bookstores as Cultural Interaction Spaces. And I'll just touch briefly on this because the article is out there for anyone who would like to read more. For this data, I turned to interviews and survey responses, 82 interviews with feminist bookstore owners and customers, 197 survey responses from customers, and additional archival material to contextualize. And what I found emerging were 4 themes about the key features of feminist bookstore. So first, access to lesbian feminist culture not readily available in mainstream venues. A quote from a respondent: "It felt like Alibaba's treasure cavern and still does. I was relieved there was a place where I could begin to quench my thirst for women role models when in other places it is diluted and harder to find." Second were the book women as cultural intermediaries, not simply being there to exchange products for money, but as active guides who are able to recommend titles, size up a person coming in and determine what they might like, and explain connections between the different products on the shelves. So one bookseller said, "I provide space, stories, and ideas that women come and use for their own empowerment." Third were the opportunities to observe and interact with other lesbian feminists. And this is what I find really interesting, the importance of the other people who are in the space, not just the book women who are selling the books and participating in the management of the store, but the other customers being so important. And having these opportunities to observe and interact with other lesbian feminists. One respondent said, "I was a young butch lesbian just coming out, and I was amazed at the older, wiser lesbians." Another said, "I went to the bookstore to meet a real adult lesbian for the first time, and I think that kept me going for the next year." And then finally, a comfortable space that feels safe for exploring ideas and identities. And by that, I mean both physical space and the general atmosphere. For the physical space, someone said, "It's not like someone came in with $5 million and put up a B. Dalton with everything matching and stuff." These tended to be cozy, eclectic kind of places that felt very homey to the women who went there. And similarly, women being able to shop for books without fear or shame, not being afraid of who might be watching or who might make comments about them, and who might not be comfortable buying the same thing at a chain store. But most importantly is this synergy. So this was summed up nicely by a bookseller who said, "Our greatest success besides staying in business is the pride, self-confidence, and empowerment we see in some of our customers over the months and years they visit us. Whether leaving a violent relationship, coming out as a lesbian, or raising a daughter, we can see how information, books, and a supportive atmosphere can change lives." So this is what led me to develop the concept of the cultural interaction space, thinking about a space where a distributor, its cultural objects, whether tangible or intangible, and its audience can come together in a physical space where interactions with each other and with the products on offer can occur. And this is relevant for bookstores, obviously, not just for feminist bookstores, but thinking about how the spaces in which we acquire and encounter cultural objects impact the ways that we experience and interpreted them. So how was it different for that young, butch, newly out lesbian to come and choose books in a feminist bookstore as compared to if she had ordered by mail or checked it out of a library? And this can also extend far beyond bookstores to other cultural circles. If we think about film, does the experience of watching a film differ depending on whether it's seen at home, in a mainstream cinema, or during a film festival? So in short, thinking more broadly about how distribution matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thanks. I really enjoyed that. We have some time here for questions. I will have some questions for Kathy, and after Sarah's spoken, we'll give her an opportunity to answer some questions, and then maybe between the two of them, a sort of a mini panel at the end, if that's all right. Are there any questions for Kathy at the moment? You can either put up your hands or type something into the chat. I can see the chat. Nobody yet.
Can't see anybody, Eben.
Okay, sorry. Just Sorry. Zoom and chat I never get along for some reason. The buttons are in different places for everybody. There we go. No, nothing come up in the chat just yet.
Maybe people are holding their fire until Sarah's. Oh, Sarah's got a question.
There we go. Sarah?
Hi, yeah, sorry to be the first person to ask one, but can you say more about the banning of books arousing lust or passion that you mentioned? That my ears pricked up.
I don't have very much information about that. It was in one of the issues. It was simply a news item that was shared for the knowledge of the other feminist booksellers. And there would be lots of, when there were censorship issues, which there were many of, as you're going to talk about. There were issues in Canada with things getting confiscated when they tried to cross the border. That was a key kind of news item that would be shared regularly, but I'm afraid I don't have any more detailed information on it than that.
No, it's great just to know about those sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Kristen.
Hi, thank you. Give me a sec. The video comes eventually. Sorry, everything's off in my office. Sorry. Oh, I'm professional. Thank you. I just wanted to see, and perhaps your article might say more about this, so I'm sure I can look it up myself. But while you're here live, you mentioned at the end the physical spaces of bookstores and using the word cozy and how respondents are talking about it in these terms. Evan's nodding his head. I've been thinking about this for a bit. I'm wondering if you could say more, if you looked more into thinking about this through the gender politics of domesticity, right? Of how that itself can be feeding, these interpretations of those cozy spaces.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I hadn't come at it in that direction, and that's certainly something to think about. And it's interesting because the coziness that they experience, I think, we have instances of not independent bookstores, the chains, who are trying to kind of mimic with the nice chairs and the fireplaces and trying to kind of, create this coziness where they have lots of resources available and they can go and pay this. A lot of the coziness of the feminist bookstores that I heard about was really a lack of money. And so it was more, okay, we've got a secondhand couch and we're going to put it over here. And we can't afford a great space. So we have this tiny little space that has nooks and crannies in it. And it's kind of maybe more haphazard than you would find in a chain bookstore. You've got hand lettered section titles on pieces of paper in calligraphy because someone happens to know how to do calligraphy. So it's interesting that it's not necessarily that I think it is curated because they want it to be cozy, but I think a lot of the coziness stems out of lack of resources as well. And then is interpreted as each store having its own personality, not unique to feminist bookstores. Obviously, there's plenty of independent bookstores that also have that coziness and that kind of shabbiness that we experience, not as run down, but as, oh, here's a great bookstore, I want to spend time in here. But I hadn't thought about that, the gender politics as another lens to look through, so I'll have to do some thinking on that.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. That was really helpful, thinking about all these different ways that these different aesthetics are sort of talking to each other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kristen. All right, we have Matthew, and then we have a chat question after that.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you for the talk. You had mentioned the ABA and the kind of prohibitive costs for many of the booksellers in joining. I was just wondering how visible the Women's National Book Association was for these bookstores, or in the newsletter. I mean, is it visible at all? I'm asking because it's an older organization, and I don't have a handle on how relevant it was. It still exists, but I don't have a real sense of its kind of cultural relevance.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm not, and so here's where I'd be completely candid and honest. When Eben asked me to come and speak, I said, well, I'll be honest with you. I have the publication from 2019. I have this other archival research that I'm working on, but it honestly has not been touched during the pandemic because of the teaching demands and online. my research just kind of got put on the back burner. So I'm not immediately calling to mind conversations. Do you know when that organization was founded?
1919, but I'm also
Oh, really old.
yeah,
Okay.
it's older. I mean, and it was formed in kind of reaction to the gender kind of exclusionary nature of the ABA. I think there were 2 women members at the time,
Okay.
but as it carried on through the decades, I just wasn't sure if it. I mean, I think I'm selfishly asking because I tried to get in contact with them recently, and I found it very difficult. So I'm not sure how they exist, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what that means.
during the time period that I've looked at in depth, I can't, it certainly was not an organization that was being talked about in any kind of regular way.
Okay.
And so now it makes me want to go back and see if there were any, any comments like, oh, there's this organization and we can't get in touch with them, or, oh, here's this organization, but they're kind of anti-feminist. So I will pay attention to that when I'm next going through the materials.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.
All right, Andrew Wertheimer has a question in the chat. Did this space differ greatly by community, such as how we see red and blue states now? I imagine it was more important in some communities. I recall Amazon, the original feminist one, in Minneapolis, and a room of one's own in Madison, and with different vibes.
Yeah. And the spaces did differ, and the need for them really differed. So you hear about the women who are in the South, the Southern bookstores really being needing those spaces even more than the Northern women did. And particularly for lesbian feminist community, and for safety, and for coming together and finding resources and knowing where to go when you were experiencing harassment or violence. They could become that center. Interestingly, San Francisco is not is historically would be a place where you would think maybe there's not as much of a need, but there were tons of feminist bookstores in San Francisco, because so I guess it kind of split between the places where the mindsets and values were similar, was really easy for them to proliferate. But then there were spaces where they were really needed more desperately, I'll say, in the South. And I just keep coming back to the South. I lived in the South for a period of time, and they were definitely needed there. And there are still some that are going strong there. But what's interesting is when you see them writing back and forth in this period of time anyway, they're all experiencing similar kinds of challenges. So there is violence, there is harassment, there is vandalism, in all different parts of the country. So it hasn't settled down yet. I expect there'll be more, maybe more clear differences as I look more at the print run going on. Let's see, and I think there were some other questions in the chat.
Julie Enster has one.
Yeah. Julie, I really love this community interaction space. Oh, music festivals. Yeah, totally. More applicable to lesbian organizing than the Pride rubric. Yeah, that's interesting. So definitely strong connections with lesbian music festivals, and presence of the feminist bookstores at the lesbian music festivals. So all of the lesbian cultural kind of activities and organizations melding together. And I think that I would say the Pride spaces are also cultural interaction spaces, that it's not unique to lesbian feminist spaces, but it would look different. So you're still having people coming together to experience a particular cultural set of cultural objects in a particular space where they're interacting with each other. So we could look at that too. If you're at a Pride festival and there's a feminist bookstore booth, how does the experience of acquiring a book and talking to people there differ from acquiring and experiencing in a different kind of distribution setting? But we could think about that in terms of experiencing the music. How is it different to experience queer music for the first time when you're at a festival with hundreds of people on a lawn someplace than if you come across a recording these days on the internet and you're just like hearing this in isolation? So how does that community context and that availability of cultural resources shift depending on where we are? Gail, could you put a rough chart? I absolutely will. I will grab that in a second. Oh, and Samantha already did it.
I got that there.
Got
Yeah.
your back,
And
Kathy.
Yeah.
Julie has put in a link to Drastic Dykes and Accidental Activists for people, which is LaShonda's.
Oh, that would be great. I
Mim's
would
book.
love that link.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Junko Onosaka's dissertation is also great. Kristen Hogan's book, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but I'll look up her book when I have a second and drop that in as well.
right.
Great, thanks for all the references.
All right. Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah.
That was excellent. And thanks for all the questions. It was really interesting little bit discussion there going on. I'm afraid I've got some weird motor going on outside my room. You may be able to hear it, maybe not. But I'm going to shift over to Sam Rayner for the next introduction.
Thank you, Eben. So yes, for those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Sam Rayner, co-chair of the network at the moment with Eben, who you've just been hearing from. It's very nice to see so many people here this afternoon. It is a fascinating session, and thank you, Kathy, for starting us off. So no pressure, Sarah. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Pyke, who will be talking to us next. Sarah is an early career academic who works on queer histories of the book. She's currently an MHRA postdoctoral research associate at Anglia Ruskin University, but she's also taught at the University of Roehampton and has held fellowships at Freie University. My German is terrible, Sarah, so you might have to apologise to everybody out there, in Berlin, and the Institute of English Studies in London. And in 2023, Sarah co-convened with Malcolm Noble a Symposium and practice-based workshop on queer bibliography, tools, methods, practices, approaches. And she's teaching a London Rare Book School course on children's books. I'm also really pleased, for those of you that didn't see the announcement via Sharp, to say that Sarah is the recipient of the Sharp 25th Anniversary Fellowship Award. And this is going to fund further research into Operation Tiger, the 1980s raids by HM Customs on Gaze the Word Bookshop in London. So this is brilliant news and will hopefully enable Sarah to continue with that research. So thank you so much, Sarah, for taking part in this afternoon, and look forward to hearing what you're going to tell us about for the next 20 minutes or so. So over to you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to speak. I've been a very eager attendee of Bookselling Research Network online meetings since I found out that there was indeed a whole group of people out there interested in bookshops. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions and thoughts on what I'm going to talk about today. And I want to do two things in the next 20 or so minutes. Firstly, to tell you the story of Operation Tiger and its aftermath, because it's so fascinating and still so wildly overlooked, and because it has everything from sex dolls to an as yet unrealised musical production featuring high-kicking customs officers. And secondly, I want to reflect on what we might learn from the modes of reading employed throughout this case, not by literary scholars or booksellers, publishing professionals, or even everyday queer readers, but by officers of the state who have their own competing investments in the material book. To begin then, it's Tuesday, 10th of April 1984 at 9:20 a.m. Without warning, two customs officers demand entry to the flat of Glenn McKee, one of the directors of London's Gaze the Word bookshop. They search the flat and seize books, meeting minutes, and personal papers. They hold him for 6 hours without representation. At 1 p.m, officers arrive at Gaze the Word. Officers arrive at Gaze the Word, 66 Marchmont Street, Bloomsbury. Shop manager Paul Hegarty is ordered to eject the browsing customers and close the shop, while officers begin to ransack it in search of imported titles. So customs have no jurisdiction over books published within the UK. What they're after are books coming into the country, and they don't need a warrant. Their powers reach even further than the police in that respect. Later that same afternoon, officers visit the home of Gaze the Word's other manager, Amanda Russell, again seizing books, but also, bizarrely, her taped videos of 80s classic soap Dallas. This was just the beginning, the start of a customs campaign against the shop and a counter campaign in its defence by customers, booksellers, the publishing industry and others that would last for over 2 years. Other shops were raided: Lavender Menace in Edinburgh, the Balham Food and Books Cooperative in South London. A mail order business, essentially Gay, was forced to close after its stock was seized and they couldn't afford to carry on. French newspaper Gay PA was stopped at Dover. The gay Christian movement were prevented from receiving their copies of The Joy of Gay Sex. And in October 1984, 9 of Gaze the Word's directors and staff were charged under the Customs Consolidation Act 1876 with importing or conspiring to import indecent and obscene material, some 100 charges. Raids continued throughout 1984 and 85 and into March 1986. Around a third of the shop's stock was seized, worth thousands of pounds. 140 titles, nearly 2,000 individual books, and a further £11,000 worth of stock at wholesale prices was seized on its way to the shop. The accused were to be brought to trial at the Old Bailey in what would have been the biggest censorship trial since that of Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1960 in the UK. The maximum penalty for each of the charges involving individual titles was 2 years in prison or a significant fine. The maximum penalty for conspiracy was life imprisonment. It was an extraordinarily punitive response. The Defend Gaze the Word campaign burst into life almost immediately. By the Sunday at the end of that first week, they were up and running, and by 1986 they'd hired two full-time campaign coordinators and were making a big noise about the case on several fronts, raising some £50,000. At one point they were even going to stage Operation Tiger the musical as a fundraiser, which I think we can all agree is a theatrical masterpiece lost. As well as public and community support, there was significant support from publishers, including Penguin, who of course had some experience with literary censorship, having successfully defended Lady Chatterley's Lover around a quarter of a century earlier. There was also real solidarity and moral support from other radical booksellers: Lavender Menace, News from Nowhere in Liverpool, Mushroom Books in Nottingham, as well as from Giovanni's Room Bookstore in the US and also bookstores in Canada. Parliament took up the case. MP Frank Dobson, whose constituency the shop was in, asked why customs were targeting books. They should, he suggested, give priority to stopping the import of heroin, a much bigger problem in the King's Cross area at that time, rather than playing the fool with a bookshop. So what happened in the case? Well, this is from Pride 1985, a fantastic float, and you can see 2 people dressed up as judges there. Yeah, it's a really strange twist in the tale. A company called Conegate were importing sex dolls into the UK from Germany, and these are also considered indecent by customs, more properly, you might think. But they took their case to the European Court of Justice, where it was decided that the seizure and destruction of these dolls was a breach of the Treaty of Rome. Although this did allow for goods to be banned on grounds of public morality, if those products were also manufactured domestically, the ban wouldn't apply. So if you make something in your country, you can also bring it in to that country. Customs therefore had to drop the charge of indecency. If sex dolls were allowed, then so were these books. Instead, they had to prove their obscenity, so slightly different grounds. They had to prove that the books were likely to deprave and corrupt under the Obscene Publications Act 1959, so an entirely different piece of legislation. This would have allowed for the defence of the public good on literary grounds, because that legislation was amended to allow for that. So the vast majority of the Gaze the Word books clearly couldn't be proved to be obscene. A very small number were returned to Giovanni's Room bookstore in Philadelphia. And so Geoffrey Robertson, the defence for the shop, writes in his memoir, "Gay literature was saved by a rubber doll." On the 27th of June 1986, which is also the anniversary of Stonewall, all charges were dropped. All but 19 titles were returned, damaged and worn, but not otherwise destroyed and not burned, as had been threatened. As Graham McKerrow, who coordinated the public campaign, put it, Operation Tiger was very serious and absolutely ridiculous from the very beginning. I just briefly want to walk through the legal framing of Operation Tiger and some previous instances of literary censorship in the UK. They tend to draw on a web of tangled and often completely archaic legislation to reach their desired ends. These are just a few examples from a long history, but it's a history that Operation Tiger tends to be left out of. So Rose Alatini's wonderfully titled Despised and Rejected, published in 1918, was banned under the Defence of the Realm Act for its portrayal of pacifism and homosexuality. Journalist James Douglas, who is better known for his pronouncements a decade later on Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, denounced Alatini's novel as a literary fungus. Next, The Well of Loneliness, tried for obscenity in November 1928 under the 1857 Obscene Publications Act. The judge cited the Hicklin test for obscenity, which stated that if a book could be held to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, then it would be deemed obscene and could be destroyed, regardless of literary merit. And the judge, in fact, ruled that literary merit was irrelevant precisely because a well-written obscene book was more harmful than a poorly written one. The more palatable the poison, the more insidious its effects. After nearly a century, the obscenity law was significantly reformed in 1959 with two major amendments to provide for the protection of literature and to strengthen the law concerning pornography. So it now allowed for the defence of the public good, meant that it was possible to argue that a work should be published on grounds of its artistic or literary merit, its scientific interest, or its educational purpose. In 1960, Penguin Books successfully relied on this defence in the Lady Chatterley's Lover trial, and a verdict of not guilty was returned, so the book could be published and sold freely for the first time since its initial banning. But not everyone was swept along by this new wave of sexual permissiveness. Censorship of works treating homosexuality continued. In 1977, Geoffrey Robertson, the barrister who would go on to act for Gaze the Word, represented Gay News in the case Mary Whitehouse versus Gay News. In the previous year, the paper had published a poem by James Kirkup, The Love That Dares to Speak Its Name, which depicts Christ as gay and was therefore considered blasphemous. So seeking to circumvent the literary merit argument, Mary Whitehouse, a notorious Christian moral crusader, sought to prosecute the newspaper under blasphemy laws. The last successful prosecution had been some 55 years earlier in 1922, and they had to go back to laws from the 17th century in order to do this. Looking up the relevant issue of Gay News, I found myself unable to actually view the poem to show it to you. The Operation Tiger charges were something slightly different to all these, because the shops directors and staff were charged under the Customs Consolidation Act 1876, as I've said. Customs officers have powers under this act to obtain and seize indecent or obscene prints, paintings, photographs, books, cards, lithographs, or other engravings, or other indecent or obscene articles. And the test for indecency that would be applied is what the ordinary man in the street would consider to be indecent. So it's a much, much looser test than is applicable to the Obscene Publications Act. And has been pointed out, the ordinary man is implicitly the heterosexual man. So in the second half of this talk, I want to think through what it means for some of the methods and concepts that we more usually see deployed in the classroom and the literature department, things like genre, the canon, close reading, to be deployed in the courtroom and in law by those for whom books are just as charged as they are for queer readers, but in a very different way. And firstly, speaking of the ordinary man on the street, much has been made, particularly in the lesbian and gay press at the time, of the customs officers' lack of literary knowledge, their lack of understanding of the generic distinctions between literature and pornography, for example, and the clumsy way in which they negotiated the shop and other large book collections. So I can't put it better than this from Capital Gay, and we're back in the shop now on the day of the first raids. Then began the long and confused process of sorting out imported titles. In charge of the literary shortlisting was a balding man with unkempt sideburns, dirty sneakers, and an oddly patterned white shirt featuring the repeated blue motif of a man riding a penny farthing bicycle past a lamppost. He spent a good deal of time on all fours on the carpet, browsing through 1 or 2 paragraphs of each new title he came across. They clearly didn't know what they were doing. They had to keep ringing up to find out what they were meant to take. When Customs and Excise searched Jonathan Cutbill's home as part of the raids, here he is on the right-hand side, they were distressed by the sight that greeted them. This is from the same Capital Gay article, and were quickly on the phone to their superiors. We're meant to be looking for pornography, and he's got about 10,000 books here. He actually has, by the end of his life, his collection was more like 40,000 books, and it did contain a great deal of pornography. That's something slightly different. There is a particular kind of strain of class-based snobbery, I think, which weaves itself through some of the campaign literature. The customs officers were criticised for their lack of literary training and for leaving school at 16, although of course those two things don't necessarily correlate. Some in the LGBTQ+ community at the time took issue with the fact that these, it transpired, were the people who decided that poems by Verlaine were indecent and had gone through Genet, marking what they considered to be the rude bits. Alison Hennigan, a writer and academic who was at the time literary editor for Gay News, was particularly outraged, not only at the infringement of the right to read what one chose, but also that they clearly had no idea whatsoever that they were among the canonical texts of English literature. She pointed out in the New Statesman at the time that these books were simultaneously on several university reading lists, and we know many were also held in academic and university libraries, including just up the road at Senate House Library. So secondly, I want to think here about methods of reading, which are highly contested among scholars, maybe a relatively small group of scholars. Often within the academy, this comes down to my mind, unhelpful distinction between professional and lay reading, or critical and pleasurable reading. But it's not that customs officers didn't read. The government employed 37 people to read the books, to search for indecent material. they just didn't do it in the way that we might recognise. So here is an example from their schedule of pages alleged to be indecent or obscene. And you can see that they've put in these page ranges, and sometimes they've been overwhelmed and just said most pages or etc. The page ranges sometimes just get very large to include, you know, almost the whole book. And this itself is a document that goes on for several pages. My point is there are other kinds of readers who are not literary scholars, and we would do well to pay them more attention. It's worth emphasising that Operation Tiger is more than just a fascinating untold story and a kind of missing piece of the history of literary censorship in the 20th century, or a crucial episode in queer print culture that deserves to be more widely known. It has real resonance today, and its repercussions are still being felt. I've thought this since I first found out about it, but I think it pertains to events in recent months, perhaps now more than ever. There's kind of the old fear of social contagion, the idea that trans teenagers may simply have spent too much time on Tumblr, for example. CILIP, the library organisation, have reported recently that 26% of librarians surveyed have been asked to censor materials addressing queer identities. There's been controversy in the UK over LGBT education in schools. This is MP Roger Godsiff. He hasn't read the books, but he says, I've seen the cover of some of the books, and I understand why parents have concerns. There are continuing protests over drag queen story hours in public libraries and other public spaces. The far-right group Turning Point UK are protesting one event at the Honor Oak pub in South London this coming Saturday, and a counter-protest has been organised. And finally, many of you will have seen recent photos from Florida schools where Governor Ron DeSantis has ordered teachers to remove all books that do not appear on state-approved reading lists, pending a review by a so-called media specialist. And this leads me to my final point, which is that what Isabel Hofmeyr calls the obscure and little studied institution of customs can be really helpful to scholars of reading history, book history. Hofmeyr's examination of reading in the Customs House in Leah Price and Matthew Rubery's collection Further Reading demonstrates what she calls customs officers' object-oriented reading. They were supposed to be object literate, and she emphasises the intimacies between official and object, how they learned the minute particularities of the commodity under their jurisdiction, determining composition by touch, feel, and handling. When it came to assessing books then, their textual component was just one element of the object as a whole. Customs looked at all aspects of the printed object: stock, binding, copyright, colophon, other paratexts, and they did sample books for obscene or indecent content, much in the same way, Hofmeyr writes, that they might have sampled a consignment of alcohol or other perishable goods for impurities. I don't know about you, but some of this sounds to me very like the kind of bibliographic attention more usually paid to the book object by the book historian or the rare bookseller. And a couple of weeks ago, as Sam mentioned, I ran with Malcolm Noble a 3-day symposium on queer bibliography, which helped to consolidate much thinking around the kinds of tools, methods, practices and approaches that we can take towards printed matter in order to find out exactly how it is that print culture might inform, acknowledge, embody or produce LGBTQ+ identities. We talked a lot about bibliographic labour, the importance of embodied reading, about emotional affect, about archives and collections as spaces where queer lives might be preserved and made visible, though not as much about bookshops as perhaps we could have done. But again, when the state is employing its own experts to read books as texts or as objects, when it's making decisions based on misreadings or not reading, when the very conjunction of the book as object with certain audiences, particularly children and young people, is perceived as threatening and morally degrading, I think we really need to understand what queer reading and book use means to those who have a wholly opposing view of it and who seek to repress it. To broaden this out hugely, but I think it's all part of the same bigger picture, English studies as a discipline is very caught up at the moment in justifying itself and trying to make the case for itself in the current climate of defunding and devaluing the humanities. But I think it needs to look at how its own objects of study are wielded by those outside itself, and at the impact that this has on people's real lives and futures. There's much more to be done on several fronts, and I hope to be kind of doing some of that myself on Operation Tiger. But I just want to end with this. Gaze the Word folded the story of Operation Tiger back into the returned stock when it came back to them with this sticker. This is Sandra Scopitoni's lesbian young adult novel, Happy Endings Are All Alike. And you can see here that it says, defend Gaze the Word, seized book. And stickers like this were placed not only on the actual books that were seized, but on all the subsequent copies of the same titles that the shop ordered in. This is both a canny marketing ploy and a kind of joyous queer rejection of state-sanctioned oppression, a sort of mark of shame turned tongue-in-cheek into a knowing badge of pride. It's a reminder, I think, of the multiple ways that a book can be read, and perhaps a case not of playing the fool with a bookshop, as Frank Dobson MP put it, but of a bookshop playing the fool. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, I think we have a lot to think about after that talk, put together with what Kathy has also been talking about. Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around. There's a question in there I was going to ask about the current Roald Dahl thing, but I haven't articulated it clearly. So let me open the floor, Sarah, to anyone else who's got any questions initially. Any comments? I see Andrew's put a comment in the chat, Sarah. I don't know if you've seen that. Talking about those books being the most common category challenged by in US libraries, and the role of US customs with Ginsberg's Howl. Yeah.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? That it was published in the UK rather because banned in the States. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this case is it opens up the networks, the kind of networks of circulation and distribution of books between the UK, the States, other countries, and it shows them getting kind of jammed and stuck because of books being held in customs, but also it shows the workarounds that bookshops are making all the time. So there's you know, there's examples of people sending books in plain packaging or sending books to different addresses because they're trying, they get wise to what customs are doing and they're trying to avoid it. So between Gaze the Word and Giovanni's Room, Houseman's Books in London also face this problem, and there's actually letters between booksellers kind of talking about the issue and how they can try and stop customs seizing their stock.
Oh, there we are. I had a question, but now DM has got a question for you. Go ahead, DM.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. That was totally dreamy and amazing. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, has your research uncovered a specific incident that or a catalyst for the operation to take place, or was it a kind of build up of kind of political attitudes and sentiment around the kind of growing AIDS crisis, or have you managed to find the person who pressed the nuclear button, so to speak, on that one? And do you intend to?
Yeah, this is really something that I want to look at because it's an interesting one. On the one hand, lesbian and gay publishing and book selling is flourishing in the 1970s and into the early 80s. Gaze the Word is in fact doing so well just prior to the raids that they are about to move premises, which they didn't do, and they're still in the same place, partly because of the financial impact that this case had on the shop. But I think with the Thatcher government coming in 1979, there was a kind of growing crackdown that would culminate probably in Section 28, which was also the catalyst of which was also kind of moral panics over books and children's books. And in a way, I think Operation Tiger is a bit of a canary in the coal mine for that. And you can see that there were these concerns around queer books and reading and printed material before Section 28 kind of paved the way. I think the AIDS crisis is also implicated because raids continued into the 80s and even into the early 90s, and a lot of material, I mean, not connected specifically to Gates the Word, but just customs raids generally. A lot of the material that was seized was public health information relating to AIDS. So yeah, it's all tied together, but I don't know if there's one kind of specific incident that sparked this off. One of the things that really jumps out when you look at the papers relating to the case is, I mean, it bears being reminded of the climate of homophobia at the time, which, you know, a lot of this is relying on people commenting on, say, magazines that they saw their neighbours having delivered to their house, or, you know, I saw him with his boyfriend in the street, so blah blah blah. I think that he's, you know, it was all just a kind of surveillance culture as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I was just going to ask, and again, is still relevant even after DM's question, I think perhaps even more so, Sarah, how do you find out all the material of this? You know, as we all know, finding out information about bookshops and things is not an easy task, but I would imagine with something like this, how are you finding the material and the letters and the, you know, is it difficult to get access to it? Are you having, you know, issues with getting permission to look at stuff that might be seen by the government as still being potentially sensitive, or, you know, how is that working?
So when I first started researching this, there was very little to look at. I'd seen Graham McKerrow, one of the campaign coordinators for the Defend Goes the Word campaign, give a public talk related to the exhibition Queer Between the Covers that Centre House Library did in 2018. And then they published this collection, which Queer Between the Covers, Histories of Queer Publishing and Publishing Queer Voices, and he put his chapter into that. So that's one source. In 2021, kind of, I suppose, just in one of those sort of strange gaps between lockdowns, Bishopsgate Institute had acquired 2 boxes of materials related to the campaign, which are where the schedule of pages I showed, that chart with all the numbers of the obscene pages, and that stuff is absolutely incredible. I mean, that's kind of has witness statements and all the details related to the campaign and the legal case, as well as more of the sort of public facing campaign materials. There's not that much of it, but it's incredibly rich and really needs to be looked at properly. And I know that the National Archives are really interested in this case, but I've spoken to a few people there and they don't seem to have a huge amount of luck finding anything about it in their collections, but that's definitely an avenue to pursue as well.
Yeah, well, can't wait to find out what you discover as the research continues. Anybody else got any questions for Sarah or for Kathy? Now we've got a bit of time at the end. Got a nice comment from Kristen in the chat, Sarah, about the ways of reading comment.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it just seems to me, particularly at the moment, that people are talking about books and reading all the time, but from these kind of wildly clashing perspectives. So yeah.
Eben the Muse.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, sort of a cross between Sarah and Kathy. Kathy's talking about the cultural interaction spaces, which I've always found really interesting. There's something self-contained about them. And Sarah's best been describing threat as a major impact on that cultural space that's going on within that. And what is the external factors that are impacting on these cultural spaces in different ways? This is open to both Sarah and Kathy. How are they changing that cultural interaction space? Are we dependent on them for certain cultural interaction spaces? Because any bookstore, not just feminist or gay or queer, but any general purpose bookstore is a threat to somebody, as the Florida has shown.
Firstly, I really, everything that Kathy was saying about the space of the bookstore, I think absolutely applies to Gay's the Word. And it's certainly that kind of sense of community, the bulletin board, the notice board, the fact that people say about Gay's the Word, it's more than just a bookshop. I think that's something that seems to be in common across many feminist, radical, queer, independent bookstores. But yes, the threat is always there, and often that's expressed in real physical violence, bricks through windows kind of situation. I think what interests me is, why is it that books are so often so charged? Why are books seen as the most dangerous and threatening objects out there? And yeah, I don't really have any particularly good answers on that, but that's what is kind of driving this research for me, is, well, why books? Because there's this other very strong cultural narrative of, well, reading is good for you,
But people also find bookstores very intimidating quite often.
Right.
So there is something going on there.
And I think when you talk about the external threats, I think about them. There's the harassment, there's the vandalism, there's also the personal threat of walking into a bookstore. So not just, as you said, that bookstores are to some seen as these rarefied spaces, that it's intimidating to walk across there, but a lot of the women that I spoke to during the research with customers talked about how it was this rite of passage to have to take a deep breath and cross the threshold of a building where you would be marked as a lesbian if someone saw you walking in there, because feminist bookstores were considered equivalent of lesbian bookstores, right? And most of them were run by lesbians, and that was the safe space. But it's interesting to think about that, what happens upon that entry, going from that portal to the outside to the inside of the cultural interaction space, and how do the interactions within become affected by what's going on outside. And it's often, there are often the places where people come to, I keep talking in the past tense, which is not the case, but there are just so many fewer of them now. And this is the same with queer bookstores, that when something is threatening the community, that's where people go, right? If there's a shooting, people go to the feminist books, and not even locally. I mean, just, national kinds of crises or larger local kinds of crises, people kind of go to the feminist bookstore as, okay, I need to be with my people. I need to be in a space that feels safe.
That's really interesting. That makes me think of the role of public libraries as well, as so often being that kind of safe space.
Yeah, and what it really struck me, I think it was in your paper, Kathy, you mentioned people coming in, a group of people coming into a bookstore, realizing it's a lesbian bookstore or a feminist bookstore, and most of them, whoops, I don't belong here. And there's one person who looks around and says, and they're kind of be coming back, because all of a sudden they felt they're in the right place. And they recognized it. Yeah. But I've just been doing a lot of reading of novels set in bookstores, and
Yeah.
frequently you have women coming in, starting up bookstores or coming to the bookstores because it's a place that they have a control over. They can articulate themselves. There's a safety and a security, but also, again, that threat thing's coming back. A lot of them are about showing the world that they can stand up to it in a way.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful
And-
force.
And just also mentioning that, that one of the other struggles, many struggles, existentially, is the idea that we're operating these bookstores and people may not feel comfortable coming in if they don't have money, because it's not like the public library where you can go in, you can get a book as long as you have the library card. And so thinking through, is that setting up an additional barrier for women to come through the space? And then but from the beginning, them being conceived of as not just bookstores, but as community centers and cultural information centers, and the places where you go to find a roommate because there's the bulletin board at the back, or there's the binder with all of the listings in it. And so I think it's really interesting that, in contrast to bookstores that, and many of the chain bookstores that exist to sell books and are in a sterile environment, they kind of shifted to trying to, create a more community atmosphere and trying to create events and trying to create spaces that feel cozy. But the feminist bookstores from the get-go said, this is what we are doing. This is, we're not in it just to share information. We're in it to build these kinds of spaces.
And I suppose it's also about the really strong connections for certain groups of people between books and bodies. This kind of, they almost get confused in so many cases. So there's a sense that, like, if you're seen, as you were just mentioning, Kathy, if you're seen reading certain material, you are also being read.
Yes.
And I think you see this in libraries and in bookstores as well, the kind of conjunction of a person with the reading material, which I suppose is what is also being weaponized in the cases that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
There's a couple more comments in the chat. One from Malcolm, who wonders if the thread which connects the two papers is about ambiguity. Seems that the feminist bookstores occupied a deliberately ambiguous place between market and anti-capitalism. I think, and another one from Andrew: feminist bookstores were somewhat normalized in alt press weeklies in the US, from the graphic novel Comic Dykes to Watch Out For, which took place in a feminist book cooperative. So that's another good link. Normalized is the wrong one. Okay. 5 a.m. Andrew, you are doing a fantastic job if you're this articulate at 5 a.m. Okay, well, we've got a quarter of an hour left, and I know Eben and I have got a couple of updates, and I'm going to just checking that just Matt has replied to my message. I didn't want to sort of blindside him by bringing him in, but before we go on to the sort of last bit of housekeeping and admin, can we all thank Kathy and Sarah for 2 brilliant papers? I'm sure there'll be lots of follow-up from this, but we can't wait to see how this research in both areas progresses. And thank you both so much for coming along this afternoon. That's made for a fantastic hour and a bit. There we are, some nice hand clapping going on everywhere. So thank you both so much. Right, Eben, if you can come back on. Well, no, actually, because I'll go straight to Matt, I think. So excitingly, as I hope all of you are aware, we have got a second iteration of the BRN conference. Will be running this year again at the start of July, hosted by the University of Reading. And Matt Chambers is very kindly kind of taking the lead on that. So Matt, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to remind everybody about deadlines and perhaps tease a bit about what your plans are for that conference.
It's still very much in the works, but thank you. And thank you both for your wonderful talks. Sarah, I knew you'd been working on this for a while, so I was really glad to finally hear a little bit more. So thank you for that. And thank you, Kathy. I just included the link in the chat, and I can send it again in case you don't see it. And I'm kind of distracted because there's a helicopter flying about 20 feet above our building right now for some mysterious reasons. It's like in the background, like Evan's engine before. But yeah, we are hosting a 2-day conference in July, and all the kind of particulars are in the link. We're working on it's a conference both for booksellers and for academics. So it's kind of, we're hoping to get people who are working in the trade to join us as well. Planning a couple special events. Because this is at Reading, I wanted to involve the special collections there. There's a wonderful special collections archive, British publishing, a lot of materials. Again, because of the helicopter, I'm flaking on specific archives at the moment, but W.H. Smith, for example, the Samuel Beckett archive is there. There's several publishers whose records are there. They will be giving us a tour, a kind of mini tour of some of the materials, some of their holdings as part of the conference. What else? And I know Eben will be joining us on a panel with some other booksellers to talk about the conference thing, basically the relationship of kind of physical book spaces with online and other forms of media, and including what happens when your bookstore is used as the centerpiece for film, when Hollywood comes calling. So I'm hoping to hear more about this. So that's in July. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is in the link. And I'm sorry for the distracted nature of this. I'm not used to having helicopters fly over our building, so I'm kind of concerned what's going on at the moment. But thank you.
The deadline for proposals is the 1st of March, but we did say if anyone's got any issues with getting them in to Matt by the 1st, then if you again drop Matt an email, and as long as he knows something's coming, so that we can help get the program together. That's really the next stage. But it's 2nd and 3rd of July is the
3rd and 4th.
3rd and 4th, sorry. I have no helicopter as an excuse. Yeah. 3rd and it's not 5 a.m. here either, but yeah, 3rd and 4th of July. So it'd be really lovely as many of you as possible could join us there, and we can properly meet in person. So that's the first thing. So thank you, Matt. The next thing, Eben, do you want to talk about the next event? Because this is really your specialty, you're and Kristen. Oh, there we are, you are prepared. So go ahead.
Yeah, just the next event is going to be on the 31st of March, the last Friday of the month. And we're going to be launching or celebrating the launch of Kristen Doyle Hyland's Cambridge University Elements, The Spaces of Bookselling, which is available to download as of today, I believe, according to the website. So I highly recommend downloading it. And Kristen's going to be talking about the book, and we'll do an interview with her probably, and other things to festively appreciate the quality of her research and her insights and her personality and her ability to talk on Zoom.
Thank you, Evan. And congratulations, Kristen. The fact that we've got the email this morning to say this has been published just seemed very fortuitous for a Friday. So yeah, if you follow the link on the page, it's free to download for the next 2 weeks, but I think Eben and I are hoping that we can persuade CUP to get that extended for BRN members, at least until we've heard from Kristen at the end of March. So there's that one, and then we actually even have the May one. This is just pre kind of prepping your diaries. May the 26th is the next one after that, and we have Professor Simon Marnie coming in to talk to us about Chinese bookshops and what's happening in China with bookshops. So that one will probably be the last one before the conference. But I'd just like to make a plea and an invitation to anybody. Eben's nodding at me, so I think he knows where this is going. But we really would welcome if anyone else wants to take on sort of next year's schedule of seminars, arranging them. Please feel free to volunteer. This is a network. It's Eben and I are not at all territorial about this. We just wanted to keep going. So if anybody else wants a go at chairing for a while, then please just get in touch. but it is so wonderful that we've got to this point where we've got people turning up, interesting papers. And as Sarah said, just to have a group of people who all love talking about bookshops is just, I can't tell you, for me, it's such a pleasure, isn't it, Eben? So,
Yes.
yeah. Anything else I've missed, Eben, that you want to add before we finish?
That's it. It's the weekend's coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is good to see everybody.
Yeah, it really is. So thank you all for turning up this afternoon. Thank you especially to Kathy and Sarah for 2 fantastic papers. And yes, go off, enjoy
Good.
Bookshops this weekend. And
The recording will be available on the website shortly.
okay, thanks,
Next
Eben.
week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye
Thanks
now.
for
Bye,
having
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Kathy.
Really
enjoyed
nice to meet you all. Thanks.
Yeah,
Looking
see you
forward to
soon.
Yeah.
Don't be
Bye.
strangers.
Oh, Evan, while I have you, one quick question. Sorry for the attack at the end. Could we post an announcement for the conference on the BRN website?
Isn't there one there? I'll
I don't think so. I mean, it's been a few days since I've checked, but last I
double check.
checked,
I'll get something up there. Yeah.
okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I'll see you guys. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Uh,